J'appelle maintenant le professeur Lexa, de l'université, radiologue à l'université d'Arizona, et qui va nous parler de l'impact des technologies disruptives dans les organisations radiologiques. C'est un titre redoutable. Thank you very much. We welcome you, and we can start.
And I want to thank you very much for that kind introduction. And I also want to have special thanks to Alan and Mark for inviting me to come to such a visionary conference and to be part of this. And I apologize that I've translated my slides into French, but I can't finish the talk in 25 minutes if I do it in French, so I'm going to speak in English, and I apologize for that. I'm going to try to give you a 25-minute journey or so through one of the most challenging things that has occurred in my career, your careers, and will continue to happen to us in radiology, and that's the notion of disruptive technologies. I'm going to talk about strategies we can take to succeed despite this kind of a challenge, and I will give you several perspectives. I'll give you the perspective of a practicing neuroradiologist, but also to give you a perspective of someone who does technology strategy work in the business school at Wharton and then in some other business schools in other parts of the world, and then also someone who's trying to help teach leadership to radiologists in my own country. And this is one of the major challenges that we face, and it's one of the things that we do teach about there. My objectives here are to discuss why disruptive technology and change is important to us and what we can do about it. I want you to understand why this happens and why it has happened already several times to me in my own career. I'm now in the second half of my career as a radiologist, and it is very easy to say that my career is very different than the people who trained me. And I would suggest that that's going to continue, and particularly for those of you who are the younger people in the audience, you will see very substantial change during your careers of the next 30 years or so. And we'll talk about how we can be agile and resilient and succeed despite these types of challenges. I also want to leave you with the notion that you really have two choices. And we've heard some great talks yesterday and this morning that have already raised this set of questions, which is that it's much better to be the changer than the one who is changed by someone else. And it is certainly much better to be the leader than to be someone who is led by someone else. And I very strongly feel that physicians should be leading and not be led by people who are non-physicians. Only physicians, only radiologists know what it's like to be in the hospital at 3 o'clock in the morning and dealing with a difficult diagnosis, a difficult case, and so we should be the people doing the leading. And again, help to prepare all of us to deal with these sorts of changes. And these are global changes. These are not changes that are limited to one country, but these are affecting all of us or will affect all of us. I also want to say a big thank you. It is a pleasure to come back to France, and I just wanted to mention that that's my grandfather, great-grandfather on the left, and there he is on the right with my own grandfather standing behind him. And he grew up in Alsace, and also family who lived in Strasbourg and in Metz, and not too far away from Nancy. So it's a very great pleasure to be here today. This is a reminder that this is a topic we have to talk about. And this is a quote from Andy Grove. He was the head of Intel, one of the most successful companies in the Silicon Valley in the United States, and a company that was remade several times because of disruptive changes in that industry. There's probably no industry on the planet that changes as rapidly and as in a disruptive fashion. And I won't read the whole quote to you, but I will put in the highlights from the original English version, that technological change and its effects are inevitable, and stopping them is not an option. We have to learn how to manage it, and we have to learn how to succeed, but we cannot pretend that we can practice the way we did 10 years ago or 20 years ago. And we see examples of this inside radiology, inside medicine, but also outside. And we see examples like ride-sharing apps that have disrupted entire industries, and not just taxi cab industries, but also parking, car ownership, and a variety of other types of industries as well. And we're going to see more of this. We're going to see this with blockchain technologies and other things. Stopping them is not an option. And another quote that I like from Mr. Grove, is that he felt that his job was to disrupt and even destroy Intel in order to save it. Because if he didn't do it, someone else would. And it's this process of remaking and adapting to technology that saved that company and made it so successful. And it's the vision that I have for radiology, is that we need to take control of these things because, again, stopping them is not an option in the long run. And we have to learn how to adapt and overcome. Another quote, which I like, from one of the most famous people in the history of France, is this notion. And I use this all the time with my neuroradiology fellows and residents, and I tell them that when you sit down to look at an MRI of the brain, I want you to be prepared. You can't rely on luck. You have to be prepared. You have to know what you're looking for. You have to know the anatomy, know the pathology. Well, the same thing is true here. If you've never heard the term disruptive technology, you'll now be prepared for it. You'll learn to see it when it occurs. And we can learn to develop many of the kinds of very interesting things we talked about yesterday, the speakers have already addressed this morning, in terms of coming up with highly adaptive technologies that can help us deal with disruption. Because it's critically that we be prepared and ready for this. One of the things that comes up a lot in discussions of things like artificial intelligence and other types of disruptive technologies are the notion of extreme pessimism or extreme optimism. I tend to be more of an Aristotelian, and I look for the middle way and understand that it's probably the smartest and best route to understand that almost all technology and technology change has both good and bad in it. And this is a quote from a very famous linguistics professor in the US from MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He was also a political activist. And I like this quote because he talks about how we can make our future, and that one of the strategies is optimism. And I would say that I am a cautious optimist, that it is important that we understand that we are not helpless, even in the face of very sophisticated artificial intelligence technologies, which are going to come up very quickly and are already here in some cases. But we can make that future better for our patients and for our profession if we learn how to manage these technologies. Now, change is inevitable, and technology change is inevitable, and I'm going to give you a classification of technology change, but I think it's important to understand that even incremental changes, even relatively small change, can eventually have disruptive effects. And this is just a quick example. When I was an intern, I did an internal medicine internship before I did my radiology residency, which is typical for the United States. And this is an example of an old cardiac defibrillator. And I worked with Bernard Lown, who won the Nobel Prize, but not for this, but for something else, but he was one of the people who worked on this. And he said that when they came out, they wanted it to be as simple as possible. Now, we know that one of the things that the manufacturers do, and one of the things that happens over time with technologies, we make it more sophisticated and sometimes more complicated. So by the time that I was working as an intern and occasionally running codes and doing cardiac defibrillation, I had a device like that. It has more buttons, it has more lights, it has a bigger screen, and it can do more. And it's more sophisticated. That's the kind of change we like. That's the kind of change that is attractive in radiology. Things get better. But what happens when the technology does this? And this is a device that I had to train on several years ago when it became available, because it's one of the things we have in the hospital. And why is that technology fundamentally different? Why am I showing you this morning? Because the answer is, how many years of medical school and training do you need to use that device? That's an automatic defibrillator. The answer is none. In the US, it took 14 years of training after high school for me to be a neuroradiologist. How many years does it take to use that device? It takes less than a day. Most of the people who work at Disneyland in the US, and probably also true at Disneyland in Paris, know how to use an automatic cardiac defibrillator. It disintermediates the notion that you have to go through all this special training, which all the radiologists in the room have done or will do, to know what we know and to be able to do what we do. Technology sometimes takes that away. And this is a reminder that it's not always the same. Now, yesterday, one of the speakers talked about developing a Cartesian structure for understanding a process and developing an intellectual framework. And I'm going to do something similar here, which is to divide technologies into 3 groups so that we can talk about how to recognize them and how to react to them. And these go from incremental technologies, which are improvements, but the technology still looks similar, to transformative technologies, where a technology replaces a pre-existing technology in what we do, and then technology that is truly disruptive. And I'm using the initial English word when this was first described in the business literature, but also trying to give you another translation for it as well. And examples of incremental technologies are one of the things that attracted me to radiology. Going to RSNA or going to meetings run by ESR and the ECR, every year technology would get better in some way. It would get faster, it would get higher quality, it could do more things, and that's attractive. I like to see things get better, but it doesn't fundamentally disrupt who uses it, and it doesn't change where you do it, how you do it, it just gets better. So we go from single slice to multi-slice, up to 128 and well beyond, as you saw in one of the presentations yesterday, and that CT continues to grow and develop and has new applications. But fundamentally, it is still being used relatively by the same people to do similar things. New opportunities, but it doesn't fundamentally degrade or change or take away the role that we play in healthcare. That's the nature of incremental technology. And just an example from MRI. These are 2 MRIs from 2 different decades, different field strengths, but very similar. The kind of technology you would see in a major hospital. And you can do a brain on either one of these. The images look better on the higher strength system on the right, which is newer, but fundamentally it's just a better model. Now, there are other technologies, though, where when a technology reaches a certain degree of maturation, it completely replaces or marginalizes the pre-existing technology. And this notion of replacement, either because of improved performance or cost, is very commonly seen. And if you look at the history of technology, we see this all the time. We go from disc players and we have cassettes. Cassettes are cheaper, the sound quality isn't quite the same. I realize for some people in the audience, these are ancient technologies, but these are all things that I have had in my life. But they become portable, and then ultimately you have devices like this, which probably most of the people in the room have one of these. Probably all of you have something like this. And with some exceptions, most of the previous technologies have been entirely replaced. I understand that some people like analog sound and therefore do have discs, but you often need very sophisticated systems in order to see the difference between analog and digital music. And the point here is that this replaces. And one of the most striking examples of this, and this is from before I started my own training, is that CT pretty much replaced pneumoencephalography. The last pneumoencephalography chair was sold in the United States pretty much at the same time that the first CT scanners were available in the US. And we don't do pneumoencephalography anymore. Even somebody with my gray hair, the only ones I've seen are in movies and they're not very accurate. We just don't do it anymore. It has completely replaced. That's a replacement technology. But this is the main topic of our conversation, which is disruptive technologies. These are different. These were first described by Clayton Christensen, who's a professor at Harvard. And he wrote this up in a series of papers with several collaborators, including the one listed here, and then it went on to become a book. And this is the notion that sometimes technologies aren't just better for the current people who use them, but they are so different that they actually change the whole market for them. And in his papers and in his book, he uses examples like inexpensive Japanese motorcycles. And back in the day when he wrote this article, that was true. Japanese motorcycles were cheaper, but they were more accessible. And they expanded the market into markets like young men who couldn't afford expensive motorcycles from Germany, from England, or from some of the US manufacturers. And it changed the market. And it changed the market so much that it almost bankrupted some of those companies because they didn't stay cheap and highly available. They had that, but then they also built very sophisticated motorcycles like many of the ones you see today. Interestingly, if you go through all of his examples, what has happened to us in radiology is probably a better example of his intellectual construct than any of the examples that are in the book. And we talked about this when I had a chance to meet him, and he agrees, and he's actually going to put some of this into one of his papers. So let's talk about what this means. I just want to emphasize one thing that's on the slide, which is it's not better quality. Those motorcycles were not better than those from BMW. They were worse, but they changed the market. Now let's look at some examples of what can happen in our own field. These are two different ultrasound machines. And as you now know, pretty much everyone in this room has an ultrasound machine in their pocket. And are the images better? Not necessarily, but it expands who can use them. And this is a threat to radiology, because when the ultrasound machines used to cost a lot of money and weren't that portable, it was hard for other people to use them. There are now medical schools in the US where every medical student, whether they're going to become a radiologist or not, learns how to use handheld ultrasound as part of their training. And it's not a completely terrible technology. In some parts of Africa, this is now how people get their obstetrical ultrasound, because these are easy to take around, and there are people doing very good projects in East Africa, among other places, with this kind of technology. But how about an example in our field? Again, two MRI systems, one on the left, one on the right. Which one has better pictures? Well, actually, the older one has better pictures, but the one on the right can be put into pretty much any office. And that's an extremity device that's sold specifically to orthopedic surgeons. And this disrupts what we do, because it changes who can be a radiologist. It also changes where you can get your imaging. I don't want to scare you by telling you all the stories that happen in my country, but we have the fear that this could easily be something that could be used in pharmacies, in shopping malls, other places like that, because it dissociates the production of images from who reads them. Another disruptive technology. This is an MRI machine, and it doesn't have great pictures. The images are not good. I was asked to look at this technology as part of a Wharton project we did several years ago. The technology actually came from the US space-based weapons program that was put out in the 1980s during the Reagan administration, before the Soviet Union changed. When that stopped, after the Soviet Union changed into Russia and the wall came down, people were thinking about, well, what else can we do with these kinds of systems? And they came up with this. This is specifically for doing intraoperative MR. The images are not good, but they're good enough for a surgeon to do their work, see if there's any residual enhancing material in the brain or in the head and neck, and it's good enough. It disrupts what we do. Another example is this. I've seen several of these in my career, and this is a scanner that's dedicated for doing ENT imaging. The images are not good. If you want to look for a small mass in the cerebellopontine angle or in the acoustic canal, you won't see it. But it's good enough to do surgical landmarks, and it doesn't need a technologist. There's no need for a technologist here. And you press a button, you get images. If you don't like them, it's like the camera on your phone, you just take another one. Very different kind of technology. And this notion of disintermediation is very important, because in the time that I grew up, the traditional chain of value for imaging was done by humans, and it went from consultation to perhaps doing customized imaging and interpretation and clinical management. Now those things can be completely separated. PACS, as you just saw, can allow you to do that. It can separate where we do imaging from where we do the interpretation, and in the United States, it often separates who does them. It's not unusual for us to have images from one site that are then sent to us for interpretation. I know that happens everywhere, but it's this fundamental notion that it separates. And again, clinicians who are not radiologists are using the technologies, companies are using it, and it continues. That's what it looked like back in the day with an analog set of images there. And sometimes I just use this image to remind my residents that at one point I did have hair. I don't have much hair anymore, but that's what was happening then. But now it can be done with technology. That integration or disintegration is up to you, and it's up to me. because these are the kinds of things that now do much of what I used to do individually, and they can do much more. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But this is the integration, and then also a reminder of something else, which is the notion that we can do imaging anywhere, and literally be anywhere. And this notion of mobile imaging, and I have bets that are going to be at the RSNA, that in fact we'll have not just CT, but MRI that's truly mobile, that would fit into a car, and not just some huge truck-like car, like the kind that we have in Texas or other places in the US, but actually relatively small cars. And you can have imaging at your house and get it done there, and that's an easy prediction. Now, are we done with disruptive technologies? Have we covered all of it? No, we haven't even begun. And these are some things you've already heard about. But this notion that we will have machines that are going to be able to, again, permit more non-radiologists to do imaging. That it'll be easier for imaging to leak away from radiology to other types of physicians and healthcare workers. We'll have machines that don't need a technologist. I just showed you an example of one, and with artificial intelligence and call centers, it's very easy to imagine that you won't have technologists at the point of care. We also have machines that will give you a quick reading, and that will be embedded in the CT scanner or MRI scanner, or you will have more sophisticated systems, either locally or nationally, that will offer you interpretations that are equivalent to a radiologist. And it keeps increasing. You're going to have images, systems that will see things that the human eye can't. And I was shown an example of this recently, of a system that is so good at measuring small parts in the brain that it's very good at predicting who will have autism spectrum disorder, Asperger's, and some other diseases like that. It can do measurements that are very hard for radiologists to see, but they can do it automatically. Robots that can do interventional procedures, and artificial intelligence systems that, as you've heard from other speakers, will integrate data in ways that it's very hard for a human to, with genomic data and other types of information. And telephone apps, and there's a company that's making one of these now that can actually read plain films, including chest x-rays. And systems that will do your peer review. I know many radiologists don't like humans doing their peer review. Maybe they will like computers more, I'm not sure. But it's a little scary, and not all robots and not all technologies are good, so it's a point to consider. And I want to give you some optimism, because that was somewhat pessimistic, but the notion that, well, if I have a computer working with me or an AI system, it'll keep me from making a mistake. And if you are reading lots of cases, or it's the middle of the night, right now at home for me it's about midnight, so probably not the best time for me to be reading a study, but to know that it won't let you miss a fracture or miss blood in the head or other things that are important in neuroradiology. Perhaps the computer will read all the boring cases, the cases that aren't very interesting, and leave the interesting cases for me. I would hope for that. The notion that perhaps the computer can give an additional diagnostic differential points that I might have missed. I might not have mentioned an exotic disease, and at least put that in, perhaps. And part of this is the notion, and this comes from the world of chess, and I want to thank Keith Dreyer, who I work with at the American College of Radiology, because he was the first person who told me about this. I don't play chess, at least not with computers, but it's this notion that humans work with computers and they play chess against each other, and it's a notion of a centaur, that you combine the best of both and it makes you more powerful, like the classical mythology. So you take the best part of the horse, which is that it can run fast, and then you put a human with a head and a brain and hands, and so you get the best of both animals. And it's this notion of being a centaur. And interestingly, in science fiction, we see these two visions of the future. And my children like science fiction. I have two boys, and they like these movies and TV shows. And interestingly, in the Star Wars series, the doctors are always robots. So in all the ones that I've seen, it's always a robot. It's never something that looks human or humanoid or even alive. It looks like a machine. In the Star Trek series, not only is there a human, but actually he's one of the main characters. So I like seeing doctors, and I would like to see more radiologists in the movies. But in that case, it's a human who has tremendous technology. And so he's more of the centaur idea. Whereas Star Wars is more the nightmare that in the future there won't be a need for radiologists because robots will do the work. How do we fight back, or how do we manage this? Well, one is to look at a value chain. I apologize I didn't translate this, but for academic reasons I wanted this to be original. I didn't want to, you can look this up, but I think I have another one that may be more helpful. But these are ways that we provide value, and this is how you manage a disruptive technology. It's to say, I'm not just a film reader, but I am someone who is a physician, and I do these other things, and the kinds of things that you promised to do when you took your pledge when you became a physician. In my own case, we did our version of the Hippocratic Oath was the Geneva Declaration, and you may have said something similar, but it's to do these kinds of things and take a much more active role in creating value. I won't go through all of them, but this is just a shorter summary, an easier summary of the kinds of things that we can do in the 21st century to be more effective in radiology. If you're interested in this, this is from the ACR website, and I know these are some things, stories from radiologists like you and me, where they're providing higher value. And we've heard a lot of examples in the last day and a half. But these are some additional ones you might want to take a look at, just ways that we can improve and increase our value. And when we think about what we can do, and I'm closing now, think about how you can understand change, understand that it's inevitable. And I wish, there are days that I wish that the world wasn't changing so fast, but we need to learn how to manage that, and to be ahead of it, and again, be the ones who do the changing rather than the ones who are changed. I think that radiologists provide a unique perspective and have a central role in healthcare. So I think it's very important that we develop the kinds of expertise, and I know we have a room of leaders. This is an extraordinary conference, but it's very important that we tell the other people in world radiology about this and try to maintain that central role in medicine. I hope this helps prepare you for disruption, and to understand that, like the Andy Grove quote, you can't ignore it, and your choices are really just two. You can be the disruptor, you can be the technology leader, or you can be disrupted and be a follower. It's much better to be the first thing. And finally, I hope that I've given you some optimism, because sometimes these talks can be very depressing, and I apologize for that. But I think it's very important that you have some optimism, because I hope that you look to tomorrow, look to the future with courage. And this is just one of my favorite quotes, and I hope I did a reasonable job of translating it. But basically, I'll say it again and paraphrase a bit, which is that the future doesn't belong to people who are timid or cowardly. Future belongs to people who are brave and who are willing to face the future. I hope this helps you do that, and again, it's been an honor to be part of your conference. Thank you.